From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Many millions of workers are earning starvation wages, and I underline that, starvation wages in this country. I'd love to hear anybody get up here and tell me that they could live on $7.25 an hour. They can live on $8 an hour. They can live on $9 an hour. You can't.
As the Senate votes to begin debate on President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, Senator Bernie Sanders is pushing an amendment to increase the federal minimum wage. We'll talk about the fight for 15 with the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. Then the House has passed H.R. 1, the most sweeping pro-democracy bill in decades, at a time when Republicans are pushing over 250 state laws to restrict voter access. We'll speak to newly elected New York Congressmember Mondaire Jones.
Many people were surprised that I defeated a billionaire who tried to purchase this congressional seat. But my election should not be the exception to the rule. Rather, it should be the norm. Once we pass H.R. 1, it will be.
Plus, as the House passes the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, we'll speak to longtime organizer Mariam Kaba, author of the new book, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate has begun work on a $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package after Vice President Kamala Harris broke a 50-50 tie on a procedural vote allowing debate to proceed Thursday. But the debate quickly ground to a halt after Wisconsin Republican Senator Ron Johnson forced Senate clerks to read the entire text of the stimulus bill aloud, more than 100,000 words spanning 628 pages.
As the American Rescue Act of 2021, Section 2, Table of Contents. The table of contents for this act is as follows. Section 1, short title. Section 2, table of contents. Title 1, Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry.
The clerks began reading mid-afternoon Thursday and finished after midnight, 10 hours and 43 minutes later. The legislation now heads to a session known as a vote-a-rama, where any senator will be able to offer an amendment that could drag out debate for hours or even days. The United States recorded nearly 1,800 new COVID-19 deaths Thursday, pushing the U.S. death toll since the start of the pandemic to over 520,000. For the first time, a 7-day average of vaccinations has topped 2 million doses, though just 8.4% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated. On Thursday, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki defended President Biden's remark that Republican governors who've lifted mask mandates are guilty of Neanderthal thinking.
He believes that if we're going to get this pandemic under control, we need to follow public health guidelines. He simply was asked the American people to abide by wearing masks for 100 days. We're at about day 40. Are we at day 40? Around there. 60 more days.
On Wednesday, Alabama Republican Governor Kay Ivey said she would end a statewide mask mandate on April 9th, joining Mississippi and Texas. Alabama has one of the lowest COVID-19 vaccination rates in the United States. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are reporting top aides to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo pressured state health officials to alter a July report in order to cover up the true number of COVID-19 deaths in nursing homes. The report was edited to only count people who died inside the nursing facilities, excluding those who got sick there and then were sent to hospitals and later died there, leaving out thousands of fatalities. The report was released as a response to criticism of Cuomo's order in March 2020, barring nursing homes from rejecting recovering coronavirus patients that were discharged from hospitals, which some feared would further spread the virus. Last spring, Governor Cuomo signed legislation shielding nursing home executives from lawsuits related to their handling of the pandemic. This comes as one of 3 women who've accused Cuomo of sexual misconduct gave her first TV interview Thursday. former aide Charlotte Bennett told CBS News anchor Norah O'Donnell that Governor Cuomo repeatedly made inappropriate comments to her, including questions about whether her experience with sexual assault had impacted her sex life.
He asked me if age difference mattered. He also explained that he was fine with anyone over 22.
And how old are you?
25.
What were you thinking as he's asking you these questions?
I thought, he's trying to sleep with me. The governor's trying to sleep with me. And I'm deeply uncomfortable, and I have to get out of this room as soon as possible.
Charlotte Bennett said she did not believe Cuomo's statement Wednesday acknowledging his accuser's claims constituted a true apology. She said, quote, "It's not an issue of my feelings. It's an issue of his actions," unquote. Top Florida Democrats have called on the acting U.S. Attorney General and the FBI to investigate Republican Governor Ron DeSantis for corruption and wrongdoing after reports that most residents over 65 in a wealthy Key Largo community had received vaccines by mid-January. 17 residents donated $5,000 each to DeSantis' political committee prior to the vaccinations. The former Republican governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, also a resident of the community, increased his contribution to $250,000. This comes amidst accusations that Governor DeSantis prioritized wealthy communities that were connected to political donors for vaccination pop-up sites. In Geneva, Switzerland, members of Doctors Without Borders held a protest outside the headquarters of the World Trade Organization Thursday, demanding a waiver on patent rights for COVID-19 drugs and vaccines. South Africa and India are leading an effort that would temporarily allow for the production of generic versions of the life-saving products. Stephen Cornish, Director General of Doctors Without Borders Switzerland, joined Thursday's protest.
If we had the waiver, we'd be able, in a number of countries, to scale up production right now, which would allow for the diagnostics, the medicines, and the vaccines to get where they're needed most. Right now, we're seeing just a trickle of vaccines making it to the global south, and this is just not acceptable in today's world.
In Arkansas, the man photographed with his feet propped on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's desk during the January 6th assault on the Capitol shouted at a federal judge Thursday that it was not fair he was being held in jail ahead of his trial. Richard Barnett has pleaded not guilty to felony charges, including obstruction of Congress and disorderly conduct in a restricted building with a dangerous weapon. In Virginia, federal agents have arrested former Trump administration official Federico Klein, charging him with assaulting a police officer with a dangerous weapon during the January 6th attack. Klein worked on Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and served as special assistant in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department. He's also a former U.S. Marine who was deployed in Iraq. This comes as federal agents are probing communications between pro-Trump insurrectionists and members of Congress or their staffers. On Thursday, the U.S. Capitol Police requested a 60-day extension of the National Guard's mission helping to protect Congress. If approved, as many as 2,200 troops could remain on Capitol Hill into May. The Senate Energy Committee has advanced Interior Secretary nominee Deb Haaland's confirmation to a full Senate vote, where Haaland is almost certain to be confirmed. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska was the only Republican on the committee who supported Haaland's nomination. Murkowski said she struggled with her decision as her constituency in oil-rich Alaska is concerned about Haaland's opposition to fracking pipelines and fossil fuel development. If confirmed, Deb Haaland would be the first Native American to serve in a cabinet post in U.S. history. The UN is urging Eritrean troops to leave Ethiopia's northern Tigray region, where there have been reports of many atrocities by multiple parties in the ongoing conflict. This is UN Human Rights Office spokesperson Ravima Shamdasani.
A preliminary analysis of the information received indicates that serious violations of international law, possibly amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, may have been committed by multiple actors, including the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, Eritrean Armed Forces, and Amhara regional forces and affiliated militia. Deeply distressing reports of sexual and gender-based violence, extrajudicial killings, widespread destruction and looting of public and private property by all parties continues to be shared.
The UN also warned of potentially catastrophic hunger and said it's still lacking the necessary access to deliver aid. Pope Francis has landed in Iraq for a much-anticipated 3-day visit where he hopes to rally the shrinking Christian community. Francis will meet with other religious leaders later today at Baghdad's Our Lady of Salvation Church, where a 2010 massacre by fighters affiliated with al-Qaeda killed over 50 people. Pope Francis' trip is also expected to include stops at historic religious sites in northern Kurdistan, where he will hold an outdoor mass for thousands in Erbil. It's the first time a pope has visited Iraq. In Italy, dozens of humanitarian aid workers have been charged with complicity in human smuggling after saving thousands of refugees from drowning in the Mediterranean as they attempted to reach European soil. The charges against over 20 humanitarian aid workers with groups including Doctors Without Borders and Save the Children come after a 4-year investigation by the Italian government, which in recent years has increasingly criminalized both refugees and rescuers. The charges carry a sentence of up to 20 years in prison each. Back in the United States, the Transportation Department's Inspector General has found the department's former secretary, Elaine Chao, the wife of Senate now Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, repeatedly misused her office to help family members, including her father and sister, who run a global shipping business with large operations in China. The Inspector General's report was referred to Trump's Justice Department last December, which declined to open a criminal investigation. Meanwhile, The Intercept reports Mitch McConnell has prepared a short list of candidates to succeed him as Kentucky senator in the event he does not serve out his full term. Normally, the governor, in this case Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, would appoint a replacement, but Republicans are pushing legislation in the Kentucky General Assembly that would strip him of that power. At the top of McConnell's list is State Attorney General Daniel Cameron, who's facing calls for impeachment over his mishandling of Breonna Taylor's case. The young EMT who was killed by police in a no-knock raid of her home last March. Texas's power grid operator, ERCOT, overcharged customers by $16 billion during last month's historic winter storm that caused power outages across the state, according to a watchdog filing. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, which sets the price of electricity, kept the emergency surge pricing in place for 33 hours longer than needed. In related news, the president and CEO of ERCOT, Bill Magnus, was fired Wednesday amidst the ongoing fallout. And in Honduras, Vice reports leaked documents have revealed the government of President Juan Orlando Hernandez paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes to over 70 journalists as part of Hernandez's efforts to control the press. The accusations are part of the latest corruption case against Hernandez's government. He's a key U.S. ally. This comes as a group of Democratic Congress members have reintroduced the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, which would suspend military aid to the Central American country until the Honduran government investigates allegations of human rights violations by their security forces. The bill is named after beloved Lenca indigenous land and water defender Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated March 3, 2016, a day before her 45th birthday. In 2017, The Guardian reported the extrajudicial killing had been planned by military intelligence specialists linked to Honduras's U.S.-trained special forces. Cáceres would have turned 50 this week. In 2019, Democracy Now! Spoke to one of her daughters, Laura Zúñiga Cáceres, in Madrid, Spain.
Then we see how the United States government continues to support governments in Honduras, which are highly repressive and violators of human rights. The United States supports these governments, particularly in the area of militarization. And at the time of my mother's murder, one of the things that caught our attention is that it was said that members of the FBI were investigating her killing, which the U.S. Embassy never clarified, even though it was not true. And the U.S. Embassy simply allowed the Honduran state to create that false narrative.
To see our coverage of Berta Cáceres' life and death and our 2019 interview with her daughter, Laura Zuniga Cáceres, at the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, visit our website, democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate voted Thursday to open debate on President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package. The final vote was 51-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie after every Republican senator voted against advancing the legislation. Democrats are hoping to pass the bill before March 14th, when extended unemployment benefits run out. The legislation has widespread support from voters. One new poll shows 77% of Americans support the bill, including nearly 60% of Republicans. But Senate Republicans are attempting to slow the process to a crawl. On Thursday, Wisconsin Republican Senator Ron Johnson forced Senate clerks to read the entire text of the stimulus bill aloud, more than 100,000 words, filling 628 pages. The House has already approved a $1.9 trillion relief package, but the Senate bill has some key differences. It reduces the number of people eligible for direct stimulus checks and does not include a provision to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour over a number of years. The unelected Senate parliamentarian recently ruled the wage increase could not be included in a bill passed through what's known as the budget reconciliation process. However, the fight for 15 is not over. The Senate will consider today an amendment by Senator Bernie Sanders to raise the hourly federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $15 over the next 5 years. Sanders spoke on the Senate floor Thursday.
This is legislation that will increase wages for 30 million American workers. And if you ask me what the great economic crisis in our country is today, it's not just high unemployment. It's not just income and wealth inequality. It is that half of our people today and before the pandemic were living paycheck to paycheck. Their wages were so low that if they had a problem with their car or their kid got sick, suddenly they were in financial crisis. And in the richest country in the history of the world, half of our people should not be facing economic desperation when their car breaks down. And the reason for that is significantly that many millions of workers are earning starvation wages, and I underline that, starvation wages in this country. I'd love to hear anybody get up here and tell me that they could live on $7.25 an hour. They could live on $8 an hour. They could live on $9 an hour. You can't.
That's Senator Bernie Sanders. To talk about the push to raise the federal minimum wage, we're joined now by the Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. He and Reverend Liz Theoharis just wrote a letter to Vice President Kamala Harris, published in The Nation, titled, VP Harris, Maybe You Were Elected for Such a Time as This. Reverend Barber, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain what you are demanding.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Amy, for having me on this morning. And we wrote that letter to Senator Harris and to Chuck Schumer and to Democrats and to President Biden. I can't help but think right now about a passage of Scripture, Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. When I went to West Virginia a few weeks ago and met with poor and low-wealth people from the hollers of West Virginia to the streets of Charleston. They were clear, white and black and brown. When passing tax cuts, they said, for the wealthy, parliamentarians have never had the last word, and they shouldn't have it now. Parliamentarian didn't rule. The parliamentarian merely advises. And they were demanding of Manchin, whose actions have just been shameful. Republicans' actions have been sinister. His have been shameful. They were demanding that Democrats have to keep pushing And as Bernie Sanders said, Senator Sanders, not one of these senators could live off of what people are living off of now. And one of them makes hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Amy, I also, we're pushing, I really want to hear Bernie Sanders also say poverty wages. We got to say poverty. 140 million people were living in poverty even before, poverty or low wages, even before this pandemic. We said that Senator Schumer should have kept it in the bill. It shouldn't have to be amended. It should have kept it in the bill and forced, and then Vice President Harris could overrule the advice of the parliamentarian. And the history is important here. The parliamentarian issue, parliamentarians advised and ruled out of order every attempt to end slavery. They ruled out of order attempts to change the Constitution, to change injustice after the Civil War. Nobody should want to be connected to that legacy. And if Senator Harris was to say no to the advisory, which has been done before, Trent Lott fired a parliamentarian, Hubert Humphrey defied him, Rockefeller. There's a history of this. And then it would force it back to the floor, which would mean the senators would have to have 60 votes to override the presiding officer. Where we are now, if Bernie puts an amendment on the floor, if the Democrats were to stick together, first of all, the amendment could pass. Then it would put it back where the parliamentarian would advise against it. Then the vice president could say no to the advice, and it then would require 60 votes. And they don't have 60 votes. Even Manchin and Sinema, those Democrats, they don't have the intestinal fortitude to vote against the bill, which is why they want to pass. They don't want to have to vote and let everybody see them vote against 15. They know, lastly, that there are 62 million workers before this pandemic who were making less than $15 an hour. They know that the poor and low-wealth people were the first to be forced to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, and the first to die. And they know that 55% of poor and low-wealth people voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. They also know, lastly, that this issue of $15 an hour, the March on Washington agenda was $2 an hour and the Civil Rights Act. $2 an hour and 63 would be $15 an hour today. 70% of the public wants this. And I think Democrats are really playing with fire here if they don't get Manchin and Sinema in check, or if Schumer pulls this out and they don't, and the vice president doesn't overrule, because you're talking about 62 million people. You're talking about 65 million poor and low wealth voters. And you're talking about in the midst of a pandemic. And it's shameful, lastly, that in the midst of this pandemic, there are three things we have not done. Number one, we have not guaranteed unemployment and sick leave. Number two, we've not expanded health care. And number three, we've not decided to pay essential workers a living wage, essential what they need, in a time in which 8 million more people have gone into poverty. Only 39% of this country can afford a $1,000 emergency. 725 is barely $15,000 a year. And tip workers make $2.13 an hour, 16 million tip workers, and 60% of them couldn't even qualify for the unemployment offered during this pandemic. This is woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. And this robbery needs to stop, and we need to do what is right.
I mean, what's fascinating here is you have a group of people, 100 people, and then, of course, there's Kamala Harris, and the majority of them are millionaires, saying $15 an hour is too much. You make a critical point about Manchin and Sinema. They have said they would not vote for that $15 an hour increase, which is not right away. It would be over a number of years. Manchin said maybe he would tolerate 11. But that you're saying if push came to shove, given its vast popularity among the American public, including Republicans, they would not go against this bill.
They don't have the guts to do it. I don't believe it. In West Virginia, 50% of the people work for less than living wage. That's 352,000 people. I've been to West Virginia. I've seen the fervor in the people. I've never seen the unity between black people from the streets of Charleston and white people from the hollows of the mountains. When we met with Manchin, we had persons from his own county, his hollow. One lady said, I knew your mama. I knew Robert Byrd. This is not what Robert Byrd was about. They have been strong. There are 900,000 poor and low-wealth people in West Virginia. In Arizona, there's about almost 1 million people who make less than a living wage. They don't want to have to vote. They want to pass. They want to be able to say, well, the parliamentarian didn't allow it. But the parliamentarian advises. The parliamentarian does rule. And the reason I'm saying this we've said to Vice President Harris is really a love statement. You have a chance here to make this our economic Selma. You have a chance to stand where Rosa Parks stood, where Fannie Lou Hamer stood, where Amelia Boynton stood, who was beat on the bridge in Selma, but also was at the Poor People's Campaign in '68. She was in Resurrection City. You have a chance to say, not only am I the first black woman in the position, but I'm going to take a position. And I'm not going to allow a parliamentary, one person, to block 62 million people who are poor and low wealth. I'm not going to allow one person to hurt 25 million people who are facing hunger right now, 30 to 40 million people that are facing eviction. I'm not going to let one person block billions of dollars being pumped into the economy, because, if they did it immediately, it would actually pump $330 billion plus into the economy. She could say, I'm not going to allow the 74 million women who are poor and low wealth in this country to continue to be hurt. No, I'm going to force you to have to vote on this. I may not be able to vote on it, but as the vice president, I'm not going to allow a parliamentarian to be more powerful than me.
Can you talk about
overrule them?
Can you talk about the legacy of the parliamentarian? You've talked about it going back to slavery.
Yeah. And that's the other reason nobody should want to be lined up with this issue, because, Amy, none of this stuff is constitutional. Nobody swore to uphold a parliamentarian. They swore to uphold the Constitution, which declares the first thing you must do if you're going to have domestic tranquility is you must establish justice. And there is no justice when we still have people making $7.25 an hour. There's no justice when in America today we declare by our outdated poverty measurement that if a person makes $12,761 a year, they are not poor. That is absurd. There is no justification in allowing a parliamentarian. And as I said, if you go back in history, every time the issue of slavery came up, parliamentarians advised against it, said it was not, it could not be brought to the floor prior to slavery, and there were attempts to do it after the Civil War, and then the whole parliamentarian filibuster issue was used constantly by white supremacists in the Congress during the Civil Rights Movement and prior to the Civil Rights Movement. This is an ugly history. And there is history, though, of it being defied. As I said, Hubert Humphrey did it. Nelson Rockefeller did it. Trent Lott fired the parliamentarian. There's no way, and that's why we were so troubled. President Biden should loose the vice president. There's no way in the world I preached the inaugural sermon. I have great respect. We're thankful for much else that's in the bill, but there's no way he should have said 2 weeks ago, I'm going to abide by the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian didn't elect him. The parliamentarian isn't a constitutional office. The parliamentarian and use of it by oppressive forces in this country has a deep and ugly history. No, overrule that parliamentarian and make those senators vote.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, conservative Dems have fought so the Biden administration sends fewer and less generous relief checks than the Trump administration did. It's a move that makes little to no political or economic sense and targets an element of relief that is most tangibly felt by everyday people, an own goal. And, I mean, the stats are staggering. You write, raising the minimum wage would, quote, lift 40% of African-American workers and 62 million poor and low-income Americans of every race.
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, I'm going to challenge even all of them. We need to stop using this language about conservative. They're not conservative. There's nothing conservative when you de-establish justice. To conserve means to hold on to something. So they're not conservative, they're not liberal, they're not moderates, they're not centrist. What is a centrist? You only make sure half the people get justice. What we are seeing is a robbing of the rights of the poor. What we are seeing is a clear violation, I believe, of the fundamental principles of the Constitution. And that's what we need to call it. It's extreme. It's catering to the corporate bloc in this country. It's a refusal to treat people right. It is literally stomping on the hopes and dreams of the very people, poor and low-wealth people, who were the main ones that have kept this economy alive in the midst of a pandemic. And lastly, there was no parliamentary issue brought up when we gave $6 trillion to the corporation. No issue brought up when 84% of the first COVID bill went to banks and corporations. No issue brought up when we gave $1.2 trillion to corporations that didn't even go through the Congress. Mnuchin just did it. And how tragic it would be to pass a bill that is less than what Republicans did, less than what McConnell did. And if Democrats are not careful, Republicans are going to outflank them. Trump and others are so cynical. They would come back, I bet you, if we don't do this, and then propose a higher minimum wage and end up outflanking Democrats. Because, you know, there's a kind of populism that has a history in this country that is economic populism, but it's also socially regressive. This makes no sense at all. Make these senators vote. So when Bernie Sanders puts this motion on the table, Democrats should stick together, goes back to the vice president. She shall overrule the advice, that's all it is, of the parliamentarian and force it to a 60-vote margin. They have to have 60 votes to overrule the vice president. And let America see. If they've got intestinal fortitude to vote against their own people, let us see that. And then we'll be clear about what we need to do in the next election. But I don't believe they have it. They just want to pass. They want to not have to vote, and they're afraid to have to vote. And if we make them do it in the public, I don't think they'll vote against the people.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, I want to thank you for taking this time. You're on the road in North Carolina to be with us, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. We'll link to the letter you and Reverend Liz Theoharis wrote to Vice President Kamala Harris, published in The Nation, again titled, VP Harris, Maybe You Were Elected for Such a Time as This. Next up, the House has passed H.R. 1, the most sweeping pro-democracy bill in decades, at a time when Republicans are pushing more than 250 state laws to restrict voting access. We'll speak with New York Congress member Mondaire Jones. Stay with us.
One day, and I'm hoping maybe then you'll say, darling, I found out I was wrong. Yes, I was wrong. So long.
So Long by the late, great Aretha Franklin. Her birthday is March 25th. She would have been 79. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives has approved the most sweeping voting rights bill in decades. The For the People Act, also known as House Resolution 1, passed Wednesday by a vote of 220 to 210, with every Republican opposing the bill. The legislation is aimed at improving voter registration and access to voting, ending partisan and racial gerrymandering, forcing the disclosure of dark money donors, increasing public funding for candidates, and imposing strict ethical and reporting standards on Congress members and members of the U.S. Supreme Court. The bill now heads to the Senate, where it's expected to be killed by Republicans unless all 50 Senate Democrats unite to end the filibuster. The House measure comes as voting rights are under attack in courthouses and state houses across the country. Republican state lawmakers have introduced over 250 bills in 43 states to limit voter access. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court appears poised to uphold controversial voting limits in Arizona in a case that would further gut the Voting Rights Act. During oral arguments Tuesday, attorney Michael Carvin, who represents the Arizona Republican Party, admitted increasing voter turnout, quote, puts us at a competitive disadvantage relative to Democrats. Politics is a zero-sum game, he said. Carvin's comment echoes a famous quote by the late conservative activist Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. In 1980, he said, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. Our leverage in the elections goes up as the voting populace goes down, Weyrich said. We're joined now by newly elected Democratic Congressmember Mondaire Jones of New York. It's great to have you with us, Congressman Jones. Can you talk about the significance of what you've just passed in the House and what you want to see happen in the Senate?
I'm so grateful to be here with you and your viewers. What we passed in the form of H.R. 1 is of foundational importance. It is literally required to save our democracy from the ongoing flagrant assault on our democracy by the Republican Party. The modern-day Republican Party cannot compete on the merits of its policy ideas. Rather, it is seeking to disenfranchise large swaths of the American electorate, especially Black and Hispanic people in southern states. And so we have to take action as the United States Congress. It's why House Democrats passed what you accurately described as the most important voting rights bill since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it is a very large bill, and it contains a lot of great things. The stuff that I've tended to focus on are automatic voter registration to enfranchise an additional 50 million people nationally, independent redistricting commissions as replacements for the practice of partisan gerrymandering of congressional districts that has allowed people like Marjorie Taylor Greene to coast to victory in general election contests simply because they have prevailed in their Republican primaries. And, of course, public campaign financing so that people from working class backgrounds who tend to be more diverse and are certainly more representative of the median American voter are able to win congressional campaigns. And by the way, when that happens, you won't have crazy people completely detached from reality because of their obscene wealth debating the need for $2,000 survival checks in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression.
So you passed it in the House, H.R. 1. It goes now to the Senate, where it's expected to die because of the filibuster. Can you talk about the use of the filibuster and what you want to see happen?
I don't expect it to die. And when I speak to my colleagues, they don't expect it to die either. We are reaching a point where, as the United States Congress, in particular in the House, continues to pass common sense legislation that has bipartisan support, by the way, when you look at stuff like the Equality Act, overwhelmingly, Democrats and Republicans don't feel like members of the LGBTQ community should be discriminated against in housing, in employment, in credit, and so on and so forth. You know, when we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that's going to be sitting at the door of the United States Senate, and you've got all these senators and also the president and vice president of the United States who were elected on the backs of Black people and brown people. And you're not going to do anything. So I think it's going to be untenable increasingly for people like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to continue to adhere to outdated norms. And by the way, the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow. I wrote yesterday that just as the filibuster was used to block major civil rights legislation a generation ago, its adherents will now be using it effectively to block the Equality Act, which I would think would be personal to Kyrsten Sinema, who's a history maker in the LGBTQ community in her own right, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and the For the People Act. And so I happen to think that if we keep the pressure on, if House Democrats continue to do their job, that folks in the United States Senate will be forced to do the right thing by the American people, to do what they were elected to do. Imagine getting to the Senate and not actually legislating. I mean, what's the point of even running?
So are you for ending the filibuster?
I am a leading proponent in the United States Congress for repealing the filibuster.
I want to ask you about what you just mentioned, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which the House, as you said, also just passed. The bill named after, of course, the African-American man who was killed last year by a white Minneapolis police officer who pressed his knee into Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. And by the way, he goes on trial, Officer Chauvin, on Monday. The legislation would ban police chokeholds, eliminate qualified immunity for officers. It also seeks to ban racial and religious profiling, certain no-knock raids, and would set up a national database to track police misconduct. Talk about the significance of this.
It is difficult to overstate the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has led to legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And by the way, this is just the beginning. Okay, this is not going to solve the issue of systemic racism, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. But as it concerns this piece of legislation, it was the culmination of those protests that we saw last summer that I participated in, that in some places are still going on. It was described by historians as the most significant civil rights movement since the last civil rights movement. And that is for good reason. For a lot of people, it was clarified for them, particularly white Americans, that systemic racism, that racism in policing is pervasive. And, of course, I have made the argument that it is extending to all parts of our society, right? It's the way you condition your ability to get necessary medical care and how much money you have in your pocket after you've deprived black families as a United States government through policy of generational wealth. It's a largely property tax-based system of public education that results in the concentration of tens of billions more dollars in white communities than in black and brown communities. But as it concerns this particular bill, it has a lot of support, and it is something that, again, if you want to speak to the constituencies that are getting Democrats elected, and you have any desire whatsoever to retain the majority in 2022, give people a reason to vote for you, and also deliver justice for people for whom justice has been long delayed.
Very quickly, Congressmember Mondaire Jones, you recently wrote a piece in the New York Daily News, Biden must cancel student debt without Congress. Can you explain this and also talk about your own experience being saddled with student debt?
We face a student debt crisis nationally to the tune of $1.7 trillion. It is unlike anything we have seen. And it is something that must be addressed by Congress. Wages have been stagnant for decades, literally decades, when you adjust for inflation, even as the cost of a 4-year college degree has soared. We saw in the early 90s the average debt for someone graduating a 4-year institution of about $9,000. And of course, now it's closer to $37,000 and some change. As wages have been stagnant during that same period, of course, we're just now fighting once again to raise the minimum wage, which hasn't changed from $7.25 since 2009. But even before then, wages have been stagnant. And so we have to do this to liberate an entire generation of young people to meaningfully participate in our economy. In my district, in Westchester and Rockland counties, thousands of young people, people my age and below, are living at home with their parents because they can't afford to be independent and own a home or pay rent. And that is because of crippling student debt matched with wage stagnation. The President of the United States can exercise his authority under the Higher Education Act and forgive that debt. But unfortunately, as of now, he has declined to do so. And so we have to make sure that we press this issue. It is an issue of gender justice and, of course, economic justice and racial justice and LGBTQ plus justice.
I wanted to finally ask you, Congressman Jones, follow up on a conversation we had yesterday with Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill and a leading Jewish activist, Mitchell Plitnick, who wrote a book called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. We were talking about vaccines and Israel, one of the largest recipients of U.S. aid. The fact that the health minister of Israel said Israel is about as responsible for making sure that Palestinians have vaccines. Israel's #1 in the world for vaccinating its own population, as the Palestinian health ministry is responsible for dolphins in the Mediterranean. Can you comment on this?
Look, I'm not familiar with those statements, but I will say I believe that Palestinians should be vaccinated. I mean, there's just no question about that. And I don't think that anyone can argue otherwise in good conscience.
And that Israel is responsible for what's happening in the occupied territories?
You know, what I have said is that we need a two-state solution in that region, and also that under the law, Palestinians and Israelis should be treated equally. I've been steadfast in that.
And are you saying that Israel should make sure that Palestinians have the vaccines?
Yes.
Mondaire Jones, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Democratic Congressmember for New York's 17th Congressional District. Next up, the House passes the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We'll speak to the longtime organizer, Mariam Kaba. She's author of the new New York Times best-selling book, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. Back in 30 seconds.
But the idea that you can actually put a wall and so that there will be no contact and that there will be, therefore, no violence, this is not true. The people who want to do violence will do the violence with or without a wall, with a little more difficulty or less difficulty. But the idea that you can actually put a wall and so that there will be no contact and that there will be therefore no violence, this is not true. The people who want to do violence will do the violence with or without a wall, with a little more difficulty or less difficulty.
With or Without the Wall by Watchaclan. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digests, go to democracynow.org. This week, the House passed the police reform measure known as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, sending it to the Senate, just as former police officer Derek Chauvin is set to go on trial Monday in Minneapolis for his role in the police killing of George Floyd. But outrage over police killings and harassment and the mass incarceration of black and brown people and immigrants has also generated calls to go beyond reform, to defund and abolish the police. This is the focus of our next guest, Mariame Kaba's new book, titled We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolished Organizing and Transforming Justice, has just hit number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list. Kaba collected essays, interviews, and other writings that she and numerous collaborators wrote between 2014, the year of the uprisings over the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and today. This week, the book made, as I said, the New York Times bestseller list. It's been called a pragmatic playbook. It also comes with a discussion guide. Mariame Kaba is a longtime organizer, abolitionist, educator, and founder of the grassroots organization Project NIA, which works to end the incarceration of children and young adults. Mariame, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Congratulations on the book and on hitting the New York Times bestseller list out of the gate. Clearly, you have hit a chord. We do this till we free us. Talk about what you're calling for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Amy, again. So I think really the reason why the book has been resonating is because of the uprisings and the struggle in the streets. The fact that so many people around the country recognize the complete and utter failures and limits of so-called reform to actually do what people want, which is to have some little modicum of justice. So I think people are impatient with incrementalism and are impatient with solutions that don't actually address the root causes of violence. And part of that is the fact that, policing is inherently violent, and that the starting point has to be to actually reduce people's contact with the police altogether. And if I always tell people, if you care about the violence of policing, then you should want as little policing as possible in any form. And so the book speaks in part to that with some writings that I've made over the years myself and with others, with some talks and speeches. It helps people understand what we mean when we talk about defunding policing and what we mean by abolishing the prison industrial complex.
Well, why don't you explain what you mean? And also, what's really important about your work is the grassroots nature of it. And if you can talk about the grassroots actions that are taking place around the country right now along the issue of challenging police brutality.
Yes. Thank you so much. I will say this. I always tell people that when we talk about prison industrial complex abolition, we're talking about a dual project. We're talking, on the one hand, a project that is about dismantling death-making institutions like policing and prisons and surveillance, and creating life-affirming ones, putting resources and investing in the things we know do keep people safe: housing, healthcare, schooling, all kinds of other things, living wages. You just talked with Reverend Barber earlier. Those types of investments are what really actually keep people safe. So that's what PIC abolition is really about at its core. In terms of the people on the ground, I do want to point out, you had a conversation earlier with Congressman Jones about the George Floyd Justice Act. And I think if you talk to people who've been on the streets all last year, basically half the year, and continue to be struggling now in their communities, they would tell you that that bill, which is really just a set of procedural reforms, is woefully insufficient. And I also keep thinking about the cruel irony of naming a bill after a police reform, supposedly bill, after someone who was killed by the police, and then to include a whole set of so-called procedural reforms that would not have prevented that person's death. So, this particular offering that they're making supposedly in Congress wouldn't have kept George Floyd alive. And I think that's just cruel irony. And I really recommend that people take a look at Derica Purnell's yesterday a great column that she wrote about this very issue. So in terms of the grassroots, organizers since May of 2020, since George Floyd's killing, have actually worked to secure divestment of nearly $1 billion from police departments around the country. And they've secured investments of at least almost $200 million in communities towards the things I mentioned are life-affirming and life-giving institutions. They have done things like over 25 cities canceled contracts with local police departments who are operating in schools, which also has saved an additional almost $40 million to be invested in student, family, and community supports and restorative justice. So people aren't sitting back and doing nothing. In fact, this past week, a new website just launched called defundpolice.org. And I'd like to really point people who are interested in the idea of defunding the police to go to that website and find a map of all the different places around the country that are organizing still, because the demand is still defund to abolish. So I think that people really should pay attention to that and see that.
Well, Mariame Kaba, I want to thank you so much for being with us, longtime organizer and abolitionist. The new book, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. In 10 seconds, why you chose that title, Mariame?
That's a chant that has been ringing out in the streets ever since 2014 in Ferguson and in New York and all around the country. I've seen and heard when I was in the streets with young people at protest, young people in Chicago screaming that.
We're going to have to leave it there. I thank you so much. That does it for our broadcast. Wearing a mask is an act of love. Wearing two is even better. Thanks for joining us.